Just talk just a little bit about rice. Trying to look a little bit. You drove past the row rice field we have going. A little bit difficult to see much other than the fact that it is row rice at this point. So I wanted to stop down here in front of where we're doing some alternate wetting and drying, intermittent flooding work. One of the first things I want to point out to everybody is obviously you can see in front of, you drove by most of those, you can see occasional posts with boxes on them. That's where our actual soil moisture monitoring is going on for what we're trying to kind of discover. So on the row rice portion, we do have hybrid planted, in this case Clearfield XL756, and behind us in the intermittent flooding we have CL153. In a perfect world and in a perfect year of seed availability and everything, we would have been able to sync those up and had it all one, but things just weren't going to work that way. We do have this work replicated also at Pine Tree. Again, the large scale that you see behind me at Pine Tree, and then some smaller scale stuff at other locations. But really trying to represent here more field scale situations, field level runs. This field is about 1,200 feet long. In the row rice, we are running all the way to the bottom. Treatments run there. For the sake of management here, because it is about a 2/10 fall, we stop, you can see, about halfway down the field, and that's just more from our ability to manage this large number of gates that you see have to happen to kind of pull this off and get a representation of different intermittent flooding triggers. So we've got a lot of soil moisture sensors out there, and trying to move forward from the, okay, the water's falling down far enough. Is it muddy? Does it need to get firm? You know, what's the trigger? At what point do I put a flood back on if I'm going to do alternate wetting and drying? And we've come a long way in terms of soil moisture sensors and what we can do. So just utilizing some watermark sensors. They're just giving us an idea of soil moisture tension, how much the plant can still extract. Just some pretty shallow sensors out there. We have some deeper ones just monitoring what's going on below, but giving us just that overall idea. And we can capture all of that data as we go. That's why we're using these boxes. The hope is in the future with how, I'll say, getting cheaper a lot of these sensors are, and the availability of the cellular data connections that we can do, that even a grower, he's not going to need the box and the wires. You can't see all the wires that are running, but running 1,000 feet down the field for our purposes. But you can just go install a node, and it's got a cellular data package on it, and you can just look at it on your phone. Which, I mean, we'll evolve to that, but when you're trying to put this many of those types of sensors in one field, you worry about some intercommunication issues and some of those things. So we stepped aside from that just for that purpose, getting too many in too close a proximity. So with this, everybody can see, especially the two bays right behind me. Again, each one is actually a run down the field. So that's kind of mimicking an individual field in that. You can see that we've got a lot of soil showing. Still pretty damp. Obviously, we've gotten a lot of rain, so we're almost due to reflood on a few of these bays. But one of the important things to consider if we're looking at alternate wetting and drying, especially in any type of levied rice, is we are using multiple inlet irrigation. You see that each run, each mimic of a field has its own set of poly pipe running down, so we can flood all the bays up uniformly, bring them all up together. But you also look at the gates down the field, and it's an imperfect illustration, but you can see that the water's deeper the further down the field. So we're actually just triggering our reflood based on the uppermost patty. The sensor's in the dead center of it. When it hits that trigger, we're going to pump the whole thing back up, and we're going to let it subside. The one problem with this year is that it keeps raining. So, the best year to do an irrigation study is not in a wet year. But we need to also see what happens in a wet year. We're obviously not having to pump a lot right now. We do have flow meters attached to this where we're pumping in, and so we're pumping on these independently and recording our actual water use for all the areas. And in a year like this, we're probably going to see a pretty drastic amount of water use reduction compared to the bays in here that are just our continuous flood all the time. So some things to be saved. We're not losing a lot in terms of weed control. By the time you actually implement this practice, you're 2 to 3 weeks in post-flood before we're going to let it start drying up anyway. By that time, we've got big rice, well canopied, getting really near to mid-season. If memory serves me, about the only thing we have run over this crop to this point is Command plus Sharpen, and then a shot of rice bow over this right here. So pretty standard 2-shot approach. On the row rice, we did have to go across it a third time, and to be fair, that was honestly just us trying to get it just dry enough to be able to get the soil moisture sensors installed properly. Had we been able to start irrigating and fertilizing just a little bit sooner, we probably wouldn't need the third shot. But you're probably going to, in row rice, want to depend on having to make 3 herbicide applications instead of trying to get away with 2. You just need to depend on making that third one. But from there, again, we hope to get to a point where we can base more off of just having a simple soil moisture sensor out in the field that we can easily monitor, even hopefully somewhat remotely, to be able to say this is when we need to pump the field back up versus, you know, again, is it muddy, is it kind of firm, you know, what is it, what's going to be too much. But the big take home is the weed control doesn't really change from that approach. The nitrogen management doesn't change. As long as you're holding that flood for the first 3 weeks or keeping it saturated through that point, our nitrogen efficiency stays the same. There's no need to touch it up. The only thing we're going to do is start letting that water ebb and flow, with the only concerns being, and will help confirm some of this if it ever stops raining, if it gets too dry at mid-season, you can get too dry and we can hurt our kernel set, we can hurt yield. Or you can let it get too dry at flowering and we can blank stuff out. Which brings us to a perfect point on the row rice component of it, that all of these soil moisture sensors are put in the top of the bed. That's where we're most concerned about actually getting across to. We know we can get it to all the rice that's planted on the side edges, but actually getting it to the rice on top. On a clay soil, we're hoping to, generally speaking, recommend a 38 to 40 inch wide bed is going to be fine. It wicks across pretty easily. Again, the steeper the field, a little bit more trouble you're going to have with getting that wick, but up here in this area, generally not a problem. So we're going to be able to wick across. If you're on a loam type soil, then really don't want to be any wider than 30 inches at all. Don't want to see any 60 inch beds on loam. I know some people are trying some 60s on clays up here. I can't say that it can't be done. Certainly on a shallow field that the water's not going to move off of quick, it may work all right. But you do have that additional time to wick a long way across there. But in those types of beds, again, we're trying to make sure we wick all the way to the middle. If you're not getting it, or if you leave the beds hip too high and leave them peaked before you put it in there, you're going to end up with a mohawk at heading where it's all going to blank out at the top, where you're never getting enough moisture to that plant. You may have it down there, but you're not getting enough into that center root mass. Again, that 4-inch depth that we're focused on, where most of the rice plant's roots are contained, not getting it in there, and we'll blank it out. Seen that a number of times. So we did pretty well on weed control. Again, I mentioned we had to do 1 extra application, have a few barnyard grass escapes, a little bit more up toward the top end of the field. That's generally going to be, I'll say, somewhat expected. Having to make maybe an additional cleanup shot at the top. Nitrogen management varies tremendously in row rice depending on how you want to approach it, including primarily how you intend to water it. You probably saw we had some vertical levees running down in the row rice. Again, that's just helping us to separate each of those irrigation runs, making sure we don't have any bleed over, but that also lets us back water up at the bottom. Why not back water up at the bottom? Rice likes water. Why don't we keep all the water in the field that we can? Added advantage, every time we pump downfield, when that water meets standing water, the flow is going to slow down and it's going to help us wick across those beds a little bit faster. You get on a really steep field where you can't back it up any distance, we're not interested in fighting that battle. But a lot of the ground around here, max about 2/10. There's an occasional, you get on the prairie, you get some very, very steep hillsides that if they were in levied rice, there is not a paddy between the levees. You are growing levee rice. Well, that's row rice. The levees are just turned the wrong way. So we're going to turn them, actually run it downhill. And I actually seen improved rice yields that way in those environments. But in that situation, if you're backing water up the field, or you can back it up a lot, we can go with a pretty normal pre-flood application of urea, and for 2/3 of that field, that's probably going to be adequate. It's that upper third that's always going to require another 100 pounds or so of urea, depending on what's going on. So some of the flags out here not only mark where the soil moisture sensors are, but also where we've put in some green seeker reference plots. You've probably heard us mention doing some of that this year as a recommendation for evaluating whether or not we do in fact need mid-season nitrogen. We don't generally recommend a mid-season on hybrid, but again, we're growing it in an unconventional way, and it's still a good check to make sure we have maximum nitrogen at the mid-season timing. So we're just about to the point now where we're well past that, and we're going to go out here and check and confirm that we're doing okay. I don't expect any loss again in this intermittent flooding up here. but I was putting them out in the row rice. I'm going to put them out over here just to ease everybody's concerns that I'm not losing any nitrogen as long as I'm holding that early flood. But over in the row rice, that's going to confirm that we're going to have to come across with probably another 100 pounds here at some point to address that nitrogen loss we had flown on. And we just had a blanket 160 units flown on the whole thing as a pre-flood, and we'll come back and I'm sure touch up the other one, but the green sicker plots will help to reference that. When we come back in, we'll harvest these in blocks just as you see them. Again, they're each representing one irrigation scheme, but we'll take each block out of here as an independent yield component, and the same in the row rice where it's split into kind of thirds, upper third, middle third, and bottom third. And generally the expectation over there will be that the middle third of the field that stays pretty nasty wet will actually be the highest yielding part of the field, with the lowest part of the field being really close but a little bit behind, and then that upper part of the field, even with added nitrogen, again, it just doesn't grow off quite the same way that rice likes to in a normal flooded condition, just won't quite get there. And if we don't hit it with enough additional nitrogen, then we may not be anywhere close to our optimum yield off of that. So a lot of information to throw at you, and especially on a gear change here, shifting off of beans. Does anybody have any questions? First group was small and they had lots of questions. Heard that.
You aren't seeing any yield difference between continuous flood and alternate weather?
No. When we are, the question was, are we seeing any yield difference between continuous flood and alternate wetting and drying? And as long as we are holding that initial flood, again, for that approximately 3 weeks, keeping it wet so we don't lose any nitrogen, and you don't encounter drought stress at mid-season or flowering, then no. But that's one of the things I hope to come out of this with, is a more general soil moisture sensor number that hopefully we can kind of bypass those concerns of not being so dry that we have to really worry about that mid-season and flowering timing, that we still have plenty of moisture, that we're not so worried that, well, we better bring the water back and minimize the amount of money we can save and water we can reduce from pumping. Because at this point that becomes kind of close. If you get a little bit late applying nitrogen and getting the flood, there's not a lot of time between then and mid-season. So actually getting to let it fall back much can be a problem before you have to bring it back. Same thing on the backside, getting past mid-season, it's kind of a short turnaround. So a little bit worried about that. If we can find kind of one level that kind of, not saying it's ever going to be cookie cutter, it's not, but if we can find one general level that can help us out with that, I think we'll get a lot closer. Speaking of cookie cutter, that's something that row rice will never be. Again, talking about those different levels of the field, the different thirds, you've basically got a true row rice field in the top third of the field, kind of an intermittent flooding field in the middle third, and a continuous flood at the bottom if you can hold water and back it up. So you're really managing 3 fields in one. And some of the difficulties this year, especially as we've expanded some of those acres and guys have tried it for the first time, is that those 3 areas of the field are going to change because they're being fertilized differently and watered differently, and you get the field encountering different stages in succession. We already have a problem with uniformity. Everybody complains about lack of uniformity in fields. Well, now you've basically made it into 3 different sections. So it does create another management option. Not recommending anything but a hybrid on row rice, blast concerns primarily. In the intermittent flooding, because we're mostly flooded and have a lot of moisture, hybrid's still preferred for that. But we do have some other varieties that have improved blast tolerance. They're not resistant, but such as, this is actually CL153, your CL172, and maybe a Taggart. And actually, believe it or not, maybe Titan, that new medium grain. It gets leaf blast, but doesn't really get neck blast. So there's always the easy move when it's already levied rice, that if you see blast show up and something happens, you can always just pump it up and help suppress that issue. But in a row rice situation, you just don't have a flood on most of it, so you don't have that option. Unless, well, a couple of guys have run into a problem and just went ahead and pulled levees across a row rice field and pumped it up. But we generally don't want to do that if we've invested into going into row rice. Nobody else has any questions? Yes, sir.
I guess with row rice, you eliminate the water weighting problem just like you had this year.
with row rice, we would at least reduce the rice water weevil problems, at least toward the upper end of the field, but we do bring in some potential other issues. Row rice, again, not just from a disease standpoint, and we don't see them often, but if we suddenly started growing a whole lot of row rice, we might see some serious bill bug problems, which is not common, but it has happened before. It's been a number of years somebody grew some row rice and it got annihilated by bill bug. That you normally see them on the levees. They burrow in right down there at the base of the plant, but they kill it and shut it down, and they'll do that when it's in a non-flooded environment where they like to burrow in. Stalk borers could potentially be an even worse problem given that environment. Again, more canopy for them to kind of work in. The plants are a lot shorter. So the whole system will kind of change if we move much acreage to that. A lot of unique problems will probably come up. We hope not, but inevitably, even from a weed control standpoint, row rice, soybean rotation sounds great until we run into not being able to have enough options to control pigweed in rice either. And then that flood will be looking really good once again as our primary control option. Luckily, we do have some good herbicide options in rice, but again, like everything, with enough pressure, it's a matter of time. Nobody else has any other questions? Y'all have a little drive left. So, thank y'all for coming out. Y'all have a good one. Enjoy the cool day.